David Lewis probably had the most bonkers idea in philosophy history. He believed that every possible world exists as real entities. This is commonly referred to as modal realism. But Lewis had his reasons for believing in it. Here he wrote in his book On the Plurality of Worlds. Why believe in a plurality of worlds? Because the hypothesis is serviceable, and that is a reason to think that it is true. The familiar analysis of necessity as truth at all possible worlds was only the beginning. I think it is clear that talk of possibilia has clarified questions in many parts of the philosophy of logic, of mind, of language, and of science, not to mention metaphysics itself. As I've mentioned before on this channel, we have two very important virtues when it comes to metaphysics and ontology: explanatory power and ontological economy. And we always aim to have a proper balance between these two virtues. We don't want to explain everything at the price of including everything as an ontological category. In other words, we want to be able to explain as much as possible with the fewest amount of ontological categories. But Lewis's proposition that we should introduce every possible world within our ontology is probably the most expensive ontological price ever proposed. It certainly makes our ontological wallet explode. But Lewis thought that the ontological price was right, for the explanatory power of possibilia is huge. Lewis makes an analog to set theory. Mathematicians have been utilizing set theory for quite some time now without any complaint at all. Sets are believed to exist because they are useful for mathematicians. And if sets exist, at least according to some set theories, there's an infinite amount of sets. Just like there would be an infinite amount of possible worlds within Lewis's ontology. And if possible worlds, like sets, are useful, then why not postulate their existence? Maybe because it's mad. But oh well. Here's a few of the problems that just sorta dissolves if we accept possible worlds. And in this episode I would like to focus a little bit on modality. For Lewis explains modality in the simplest possible way through his ontology. To begin with, we have the notion of accessibility. It simply is the case that some worlds aren't accessible from the standpoint of our world. This concept is kind of vague and relative, so don't worry too much about it. We don't have to get into the technical weeds that much. Whenever we say that something is possible, we're in fact claiming that that is the case in some possible worlds, but not others. Take this sentence. 1. Possibly there are unicorns. What that sentence simply claims is that there is some possible world where there are unicorns. So this sentence is true from the standpoint of our world, if and only if there is some world W that is accessible from our world where there are unicorns. But this sort of makes sense, right? Because, okay, let's say that you ask me, will you turn in your essay on time? And I answer, that's possible. Then what I'm claiming is that there is not only some worlds where I or my counterpart in fact turn in the essay on time, but also that there are some worlds where my counterpart doesn't turn in the essay on time. And with the usage of the word possible, I am simply referring to these different worlds, which makes the statement true. And in contrast with possible, whenever we make a claim that something is necessary, we're in fact claiming that that is the case in all possible worlds. So if we take this sentence, 2. Necessarily unicorns exist. And the sentence is true from the standpoint of our world. If and only if there are unicorns within every possible world that are accessible from the standpoint of our world. But here's the thing, if we would remove accessibility here, that would make this sentence to mean that within every possible world there are unicorns, but that would elevate them to be necessary beings, which is weird. I believe there are no such things as necessary beings, because what would that be? But let's take this sentence instead. All swans are necessarily birds. This sentence simply states that in all possible worlds where swans exist, it is true that they are also birds. Or as Lewis puts it, necessarily all swans are birds if and only if, for any world W, quantifying only over parts of W, all swans are birds. More simply, if and only if all swans, no matter what world they are part of, are birds. But this sort of makes sense as well, right? Because if we have a possible world where we have a swan that is not a bird, that would probably not be a swan, right? We would probably call it something else. And what this sentence also claims is that we cannot have a world where we have a swan that is also not a bird at the same time. Then there's a ton of other words that work similarly. If you take, for instance, the word impossible, what you're claiming is that it is not the case in any possible world. For instance, something being a chair and not a chair at the same time. That is impossible. So it is the case within every possible world that you cannot have an object being both P and not P at the same time. And that is true for all possible worlds. And whenever someone claims that something is contingent, it means that it is merely the case in some worlds but not others. And here is the thing. So the words necessary and possibly works as quantifiers over possible worlds. If you don't know what quantifiers are, then don't worry about it. And here is one of the reasons why it makes sense to postulate possible worlds. Because we would want to say that words like could, possibly, necessary, might, etc. have meaning. They are not meaningless expressions. According to Lewis, these words are robust and have meaning. And the only way that they can have meaning is if they have truth value. And the only way to get truth value is through possible worlds. Because if we don't have possible worlds, whenever we use a word like necessarily, what are we referring to? Nothing. But if we're referring to nothing, how can that statement be true or false, and therefore meaningful? And this is one of the reasons why Lewis believes in possibilia, because with it, all modal sentences can derive their meaning and truth value. If something is possible, what makes that statement true are the possible worlds. But do we really need to postulate possible worlds in order to accommodate truth value to these words? I believe that there actually is a way to dodge the bullet of modal realism, which Lewis sometimes referred to as ersatz worlds. But that is a subject for a whole nother episode. So if you want to know more about that, make sure to subscribe. But coming up, I'll discuss another topic which gives us even better reasons to postulate possible worlds. And that is because modal realism explains the issue of counterfactuals and causality in a simple but ingenious way. I hope you learned something new in this episode. If you did, make sure to hit that like button, and I'll see you in a future episode. Take care.